Sydney's shiny new metro is a week old now. The hype's died down, the cameras are gone, the train spotters are gone. It's just us commuters now. Let's ride. Each station has its own unique look. Here in Waterloo there's a large Indigenous population and the art here reflects that. The platforms are quite deep, an average of 35 metres, so we're going down the equivalent of 12 stories here. It is pretty quiet down here at the moment, but it is very early, not even 6 a.m. yet, so the station's pretty empty, but that'll pick up during peak hour. When it gets busy, and it does, it carries 70,000 people during the peak hours. The first section of the metro opened in 2019 and runs through North Sydney. This new section adds a tunnel under Sydney Harbour and heads south, linking to 8 new or upgraded stations through the heart of the CBD. Next year, the final section of this line heading further southwest will be opened, giving it a total length of 66 kilometres. So a short ride this morning. We're here at Mountain Place. 3 stops, took about 5 minutes. Another beautiful architecturally designed station here. So Sydney's financial district is just above us, but it's another long escalator ride to the top. Well, so far this project's cost $14.5 billion, but the diggings are just getting started. Just across the road behind me here, you can see construction beginning on another new station, another new line, this one linking to Sydney's west. That's due for completion in 2032. Paul Allen, Bloomberg, Sydney.
That's brilliant. Our next guest, Philip Vivian, is the Managing Director at the architecture firm Smarts, and they've worked on various projects for the city, including the integrated station developments in North Sydney and the CBD. Philip, really great to have you with us. I kind of wanted to start the conversation about kind of the big picture question, right? Because obviously this is a country, not just a city, dealing with a cost of living crisis, a dwelling crisis, a housing crisis. Has Australia gotten it wrong when it comes to city planning?
I don't think we've got it wrong. We're in transition. So if I can step back for a minute, Sydney developed in the latter half of the 20th century as a car-dependent city. So it had a city centre and then it sprawled outwards with low-density suburbs. Now, I think we got it wrong in that sense. We've reached the limits of that sort of growth. What we now need to do is densify as a city. And we actually, in the 21st century, need to create a low-carbon form of city. Now, having put in metro lines, one just completed and one proposed, they are the first steps in creating a low-carbon form of city and a way of densifying the suburbs so that we can have dense clusters around our metro stations and not just this low-density sprawl with one city centre.
So you've talked about building infrastructure housing around rail centres, right, and rail lines. How does that potentially work, and would that work for Sydney, or would that work in other Australian cities?
Yes, it will. So the government in New South Wales has just created what's called the Transport-Oriented Development set, which allows increased density in housing around metro stations. And I believe that's a fantastic thing to do. That will increase density. To be honest, I wish they had done it 8 years ago when they first introduced Metro, and that would have allowed them to sell that extra density to developers and help pay for the Metro line. And that's what happened at Crossrail in London. And Crossrail was actually 30% paid for by value capture. That didn't happen in Sydney, and unfortunately that boat has sailed on Metro Line 1, but I think it would be interesting to consider whether we do that on Metro Line 2, on West Metro.
You just mentioned London. I wonder if there's any other cities that you've seen that transition from being car dependent to low emissions happen as seamlessly as possible. Are there sort of models that you think Australia could adopt?
Look, perhaps I can touch on some cities at the extremes. If you take Los Angeles, that's the extreme of one big centre and low density sprawl forever. Look at cities that really get transport right, New York, Paris, they're dense cities, they've got a lot of public transport, you don't need cars in those cities. And I think then if you try to find a city in between, you're probably looking at London, which has a lot of dense centres. It's a polycentric city, it's got a network of public transport, but it it still has low density areas. So I think London gets that balance right, and Australians are used to, we have a UK heritage originally, and I think we're used to that city type. The other city that I'd mention is probably Toronto, which has developed away from its single city centre and started to have transport lines with density around those transport lines. So somewhere between Toronto as a modern city, London as an older city that has that mix.
And Philip, you mentioned New York and Manhattan as well. I mean, living there, what I noticed was that it was really good to get around within Manhattan, but getting to the suburbs, really a headache. Everything is so spread out, and really public transportation is not necessarily the best way to get to the suburbs. What does this revamp of what's happening in Australia mean for suburbs and housing?
Well, it's a good question. Look, I also lived in New York for a long time, and typically sort of lived on Manhattan, but yes, some of the lines that go out to the suburbs do become quite radial out from a city centre. But New York is developing density in those suburbs and stopping its sprawl. Your question, what does it mean for Australian transport? I think what we need to develop is dense clusters of mixed use density around our transport areas to promote low carbon forms of transport. So sustainable transport on metro, also bike transport, walking, and that gives us these clusters of density. We will still have suburbs in between our metro stations. And they can be low density suburbs, but I still think we're looking for that slight increase in density in the suburbs, that missing middle. But ideally what we need to do is promote a vision. I think we need vision from our government of how our cities will develop. At the moment, there's a lack of vision, and there is developers put in what's called a planning proposal to randomly upzone areas that they think they could get extra density. And so planning is sort of being led by the private sector. I think we need government to take control and say, this is how we envisage our city transitioning to a low carbon form of city, and let the population know that there will be density here, there'll be opportunities for medium density here, and kind of promote a vision of how our city will develop, rather than just, at the moment, they're promoting a metro transport project, which is a fantastic infrastructure project, but they are not coupling it with the city vision that goes with it. It's promoted as a transport project, not a city transformation project.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about Sydney being a global city, and I think lots of us at Bloomberg have lived in other places and worked in other places before kind of coming home, and in a lot of ways Sydney doesn't feel like a global city, right? Particularly when it comes to the vitality of the central business district. Do you think this can help that?
As in the metro line, help us?
Or other things, as a city planner, sort of, adjacent, what would you do?
I'll step back a bit and give you a little bit of background on me. So I'm an architect and urban designer. I grew up in Perth and studied architecture in Perth, which is a completely suburban city, and I really didn't feel comfortable there. I then went and studied urban design in New York, which is the exact opposite. It's this highly, highly dense city. And I now work, I worked in Melbourne for a long time, I now work in Sydney. And I feel those cities sit in between, and I think our urban future is towards a denser city model, a London type model. I don't think we're going to get as dense as New York or Manhattan, and I think metro lines and transport is part of that transition, promoting density. What I'm looking for is government to actually tell people what the vision is, and so that people can see that there will be density around stations and take advantage of that, see that their lifestyle will change, understand that that means that we're transitioning to a lower carbon form of city, which we need to do with our climate crisis. So I think metro is a vital part of that, and already, look, I've been working on metro for 8 years now, and so I really understand it. And I've seen visions of the stations. I've designed the OFAS station developments at 2 of those stops. And I went on it early this week when it opened, and I was still blown away how impressive it was. It really felt like we were in the beginning of an urban age, in a dense city that had a sort of vitality to it. It no longer felt like our old car-dependent city with the suburbs around it. I just felt this energy that I'd never felt, and I expected the transition, and I thought that the people of Sydney would be, surprised, and I was incredibly surprised at how I felt going on that transport.
Do you think there needs to be a push of a different vision of what home ownership or, dwellings look like, right? Because I feel like there's still this mentality that as Australians, we want a house, we want a backyard, we want a picket fence. In almost all cities in Asia, in New York, in major global cities, it is perfectly acceptable and great to raise your family in an apartment, in a high-rise.
Yep. I think that transition's already underway. I think people are increasingly very happy living in an apartment, perhaps raising their family when they're young in an apartment. I do understand people's desire. Some people want a backyard for a period of time, but I see Australians being much more comfortable in apartments. I see different forms of ownership. So we're starting to get a lot of build-to-rent apartments. So there's less emphasis on owning your own home. And indeed at Gadigal Station South, we've just done a build-to-rent project there. So that will give people the opportunity to live in the city. And they can rent for 6 months or a year and see if they like it. They could then go on to ownership or stay in that model of housing. So I think we're breaking open what used to be just single-family homes in the suburbs. And if I go back to the 60s, living in an apartment was seen as not socioeconomically desirable. I think that has gone. It's equally as good to live in an apartment as a house, and we're now looking at build to rent. We're looking at micro apartments. There's many more viable forms of living. We've got a lot of students that are activating our city centres and living around campus, and that's really adding vitality to city campuses. So I see Australians having much more housing choice, and I think that's what we need in our city, is more choice. And choice will provide affordability so that you can choose where you want to live depending on your age and your stage of life.